Welcome to my presentation on my dissertation thesis looking at oat straw in the Haylage diet. There are four key contexts that set the background for why my research is important. The first one being equine obesity, as it is one of the greatest equine welfare concerns that horse owners face today. Obese horses are more susceptible to laminitis, osteoarthritis, hyperinsulinemia, and equine metabolic syndrome. There are few reasons why obesity is on the rise, domestication being one of them due to reduced exercise and increased provision of higher quality forage year-round. Some horses also have the thrifty genotype, which makes them more resistant to weight loss even when they're being fed a reduced forage intake. Horses also need to continuously forage throughout the day as they're trickle feeders, which makes it difficult for us to reduce forage intake. And the influence that horse owners have on managing obesity rates is very important. Research has documented obesity rates ranging from 21 to 41% in competition horses and 30 to 50% in leisure horses. Horse owners struggle to recognize and manage obesity, and this is due to the insufficient knowledge and difficulties adhering to weight loss regimes. There is a knowledge gap that exists between owners and nutritionists, as well as between vets and nutritionists. Owners also prefer to go to vets for nutrition advice, but research has documented that the vets experience similar knowledge gap in equine nutrition because they have to acquire knowledge around so many topics, and nutrition isn't able to get covered in as much detail in their study programs. Factors such as opinions from other horse owners, what the owner believes is the right thing to do, and the owner's physical time constraints affect an owner's ability to stick to a weight loss regime long term. So the ideal scenario to combat this would be finding a way you can manage obesity effectively, but in a way that has minimal time and labor commitment from the owner's side. Horses require a daily dry matter intake of 1.5% body weight to reduce the risk of gastrointestinal disease and behavioral issues. However, even this amount of forage can provide too much energy for some horses, and the efficacy of different management methods that aim to restrict forage intake or prolong feeding show varying results and often come with additional welfare problems. Restricting forage intake is one of the most common methods used to induce weight loss, and while it has shown some efficacy in achieving this, the results are often short-lived, and it can increase the risk of developing gastric ulcers, stereotypies, colic, and changes in heart rate, which all negatively impact performance and overall welfare. Several other methods have been tried and tested, including slow feeders and soaking, which showed some efficacy in also reducing consumption rate, but these methods bring their additional welfare problems, such as compensatory behavior, musculoskeletal problems, frustration, and increased time and labor requirement for the owner. Horses have an etiological requirement to chew, and this need developed an evolutionary purpose to help them break down the tough fibrous foods that they must eat today. And it is also a byproduct of the large volume of food that they consume throughout the day. However, it may be more complex than that. It is believed that chewing increases saliva production, which buffers stomach acid, and thereby reduces the risk of gastric ulcers. Although chewing increasing saliva production is surprisingly understudied given the number of claims made about it. Chewing may also be exhibited due to the psychological benefits it can provide. Drawing from humans and pigs research, increased chewing duration and frequency reduce total intake and increased feelings of satiety. Even though satiation has not been thoroughly studied in horses, there are some equine studies that have recorded slower consumption rates and reduced intakes on straw-based diets. Jansen et al. 2021 measured higher serotonin levels, which is a hormone linked to satiation, in horses fed a 50% oat straw, 50% haylage diet. This means that not only could straw prolong feeding, reduce intake, and thereby promote weight loss, it may also help horses feel more satiated and further decrease their feeling of wanting to eat. So what does this mean for the welfare of horses? Well, straw could be a new method that supports both obese and gastric ulcer-prone horses, whether the horse suffers from both simultaneously or just from one of these welfare concerns. This led to my research question. How does the inclusion of 50% oat straw in the haylage diet affect body weight, number of bowel movements, chewing rate, and consumption rate compared to a haylage-only diet? My aim was to compare these variables between horses eating a 50% oat straw, 50% haylage diet, and 100% haylage diet at the start and end of each study period. These variables were body weight, number of feces piles produced over a 15-hour period, number of chews in 5 minutes, and weight of forage per hour. I then wanted to determine the statistically significant differences between these variables as well as between the diets, and find out if there were any correlations between chewing rate and consumption rate. For this, I came up with 5 hypotheses, one for each of my variables. My hypotheses addressed differences in body weight, number of feces piles, chews per 5 minutes, weight of forage, and the correlation between chewing rate and consumption rate on the 2 study diets. I will address these hypotheses further in my results section. As for my materials and method, I recruited 8 horses split into 2 groups of 4. I conducted a 2 times 7 day crossover study design where 7 days was equal to 1 period. I also had a 2-day acclimation period to gradually introduce straw into the diet, and all horses were randomly divided into Group A and Group B. The crossover study design meant that all horses were subjected to both diets for a 7-day period each. I measured the number of bowel movements on day 1 and day 7 of each period. This was the same for chewing and the weight of forage, but body weight was measured on the first day of period 1, the first day of period 2, and the last day of period 2. As for the results, weight loss occurred for both diets after period 1, but the weight loss was greater for the 50% oat straw, 50% Haylage diet. While in period 2, both diets resulted in weight gain, although this weight gain was higher on the Haylage only diet. These results were not statistically significant, so I rejected my first hypothesis. On day 1, the number of bowel movements did not differ between the diets, whereas on day 7, the number of bowel movements was lower on the 50% straw, 50% Haylage diet. These results were not statistically significant, so I rejected my second hypothesis. On day 1, the chewing rate was lower on the 50% straw, 50% Haylage diet compared to the Haylage only diet. On day 7, the opposite was true, where chewing rate on the 50% straw, 50% Haylage diet was higher compared to that of the 100% Haylage diet. Interestingly, the chewing rate on the 100% Haylage diet did not differ between day 1 and day 7. However, these results were not statistically significant, so I rejected my third hypothesis. On day 1, the consumption rate on the 50% straw, 50% Haylage diet was lower than the consumption rate on the 100% Haylage diet. On day 7, the consumption rate on the 50% straw, 50% Haylage diet decreased even further, and the consumption rate on the 100% Haylage diet increased further. The decrease in consumption rate on day 7 between the 50% straw, 50% Haylage diet and the 100% Haylage diet was statistically significant. In my thesis, I did reject my hypothesis because I could not ascertain whether this statistically significant decrease would be the case for consecutive weeks. However, in hindsight, I believe that rewording the hypothesis into 2 sub-hypotheses, for example, there was a statistically significant decrease in the weight of forage consumed per hour on the 50% straw, 50% Haylage diet compared to the Haylage only diet on day 7, and then a separate hypothesis for day 1, then I would have been able to partially accept my hypothesis. On the 50% straw, 50% Haylage diet, there was a negative trend between chewing rate and consumption rate. This result was not statistically significant, so my hypothesis was rejected. On the 100% Haylage diet, there was a positive trend between chewing rate and consumption rate. This result was not statistically significant, so my hypothesis was rejected. All the results that I obtained were not statistically significant due to time and resource constraints. They may have been biologically significant because the oat straw and Haylage diet, the 50% oat straw, 50% Haylage diet led to more positive outcomes. However, longitudinal trials with more horses would be needed to ultimately find out if these results would come up as statistically significant. Both diets resulted in weight loss in period 1, although interestingly, the straw and Haylage diet resulted in a greater amount of weight loss. The most plausible reason for this is the reduced energy intake on the straw and Haylage diet due to higher neutral detergent fiber content in straw, as well as lower digestibility compared to Haylage. This reason is in agreement with previous studies that have recorded greater weight loss when straw was included in the forage diet. However, since my study was short-term, the weight loss may have also been caused by depletion of glycogen reserves and decreased gut fill due to a sudden decrease in energy intake. This means it cannot be assumed that the weight loss will occur in consecutive weeks. For my study, horses' routines also had to remain unchanged, and so turnout was a confounding variable, as horses could have engaged in free exercise. Therefore, the increased energy expenditure was not isolated from the reduced energy intake on straw diets. The straw and Haylage diet reduced the number of bowel movements, which is indicative of a slower passage rate. Since there was no difference between diets on day 1, this is probably due to both groups receiving a pre-study Haylage only diet. And as it takes about 40 hours for digesta to pass through the digestive tract, the differences between the diets by day 7 were probably more indicative of a diet effect. The reason for the reduced passage rate is believed to be due to the digestive tract adapting to increase digestibility and maximize fiber utilization, particularly from highly lignified forages. This is reflected in other studies that fed oat straw and barley straw, where they found reduced passage rates and increased digestibility when straw was included compared to meadow and alfalfa hay. Another possible reason for the reduced number of bowel movements on the straw and haylage diet might be the increased feelings of satiety caused by reduced ghrelin secretion occurring when high fiber diets remain in the digestive tract for a long period of time. A study in pigs found that when they were fed higher amounts of insoluble fiber, digesta was retained for longer and they reduced their food intake. Although studies in horses have not directly measured this feedback loop between passage rates and satiety, Jansen et al. 2021 did find increased serotonin levels, as mentioned previously, when horses were fed 50% straw, 50% haylage diets, and hypothesized that satiety was one of the reasons for the reduced consumption rate on the straw and haylage diet. There was a greater variation in chewing rate on the straw and haylage diet compared to the haylage-only diet. This result was unexpected because it did not show a clear trend, but straw seemed to have a greater effect as chewing rate on the haylage-only diet did not differ between day 1 and day 7. The most likely explanation for the lower chewing rate on day 1 would be the novelty of the straw forage, which has been shown in previous research to alter the horse's willingness to feed. Straw is also less palatable, so horses may have spent more time searching for the more palatable haylage proportion of the ration, and consequently would have spent less time chewing within the 5-minute time frame that I recorded chewing rate for. It takes about 3 to 4 days for the horse's variability in feeding behavior to decrease, and so this may explain why chewing rate on day 7 increased, as straw was no longer a novelty. Even if the variations in chewing rate is due to an increase in search behaviors, it is arguably still beneficial because it provides enrichment and allows horses to be preoccupied for longer, as they would be able to engage in natural behaviors such as sorting through forage like they would do if they were roaming freely or in pasture. It is important to note, though, that the units of measurement that are used to report chewing rates vary from study to study, which makes it difficult to compare findings of my study with previous research. Chews per minute or chews per 5 minutes, as reported in my study, might be the most realistic way to report chewing rates, as this is easier for owners to understand and implement in their routines compared to chews per kilogram, for example. Straw had the greatest effect on consumption rate, as statistically significant results were observed within a week. There are a number of reasons why consumption rate was lower on the straw and haylage diet, all of which are in agreement with previous studies. These reasons being low palatability and digestibility of oat straw, increased gut fill and satiation, and increased search behaviors in response to straw's novelty. However, the consumption was only measured for the first 2 hours in my study, so it is uncertain how consumption rate would differ if data was collected for the entire ration. Additionally, I used hay nets to prevent horses separating the haylage from the straw, but this could have been a confounding variable which may have slowed down consumption further, and hence a future study without hay nets would be useful for comparison. However, all hay nets that were used in my study were of the same design and size, and the horses were already habituated to eating from these hay nets, so that it might have not been as big a confounding variable as anticipated. Also, the use of hay nets adds an element of practical application because horse owners typically feed forage and hay nets to when managing obese horses, not on the floor. The results of the present study adds to the existing literature consistently finding decreased consumption rates when straw is included, even with a higher dry matter intake allowance. My study highlighted that an increased chewing rate does not necessarily result in a higher consumption rate as well, and that bite rate may be an intermediary between the two. As this was the first study to directly investigate correlation between chewing rate and consumption rate, establishing the reasons for these findings were difficult because there wasn't any previous literature on the topic. In my study, I had constraints that didn't allow me to measure chewing rate and consumption rate for the same amount of time, and therefore to accurately interpret the correlation between consumption rate and chewing rate, I would need to repeat the study whereby the weight of forage is measured at more frequent time intervals, for example, every 20 minutes, and then chewing would also be measured every 5 minutes and every 20 minutes as well. So in conclusion, oat straw inclusion in the forage diet may improve both the physiological and psychological welfare of obese horses, specifically by prolonging feeding, increasing chewing opportunity, decreasing energy intake, and potentially increasing satiety. Feeding oat straw to obese horses can simplify obesity management for owners, as it can be fed ad lib without worrying about drastic weight gain. And the methods of measuring chewing rate, consumption rate, and the number of bowel movements implemented in my study can be feasibly transferred to owners' routines to track individual horses' responses to new diets. The benefits of oat straw may extend to the management of ulcer-prone horses and those with stereotypies by prolonging feeding and providing enrichment, and by potentially aiding the secretion of saliva. Although significant differences were not found in the short-term study, findings agreed with and built upon previous literature, while also challenging previously unsubstantiated assumptions of straw's unsuitability. This research has a lot of scope for industry application, mainly in bringing new perspectives to the industry, encouraging changes in obesity management practices, and shining light on the future direction of research focus. As straw is not currently accepted as a suitable substitute, this new research may be able to change that perception, and it might mean that everything from riding school horses to competition horses and happy acres are all able to benefit from the enrichment and health benefits that straw may be able to provide. It is also surprising how negatively straw is often viewed, given that this opinion is not based on an extensive amount of academic research, and the few that exist have flawed methods. Decreasing energy intake, slowing consumption, increasing chewing opportunity, all while maintaining a higher dry matter intake allowance, and reducing the risk of horses going for long periods without food, are ways that straw can serve a dual purpose to help combat two of the most pressing equine welfare concerns simultaneously, this being gastric ulcers and equine obesity. This means owners will be switching from treatment to prevention, which is more cost-effective and likely to be less stressful in the long run. When it comes to designing a methodology, the reliability and applicability of it to a real-life situation should be considered. The methods used in my study can be easily used by a horse owner wanting to monitor their horse's responses to a new diet, and any horse owner can count their horse's chewing, measure their consumption, and count the number of bowel movements and make comparisons. In my study design, I also implemented the diets in a way that horses would normally, given their time constraints. So for example, I provided forage and rations once in the morning and once in the evening, whereas researchers in other studies were around to top up the forage once it ran out, or they spread meals throughout the day. And this is not easily transferable to a horse owner who is not likely to be around 24/7. And the fact that I could see positive results through time-restricted data collection methods and periods is very promising. And lastly, studies should have the end user in mind. We need to consider how the knowledge is transferred to those most responsible for the management or prevention of conditions like obesity and gastric ulcers. There's very little point in doing all this research, but if we don't actually know whether it gets to the owners at all, or whether they actually understand it and how to apply it. And therefore, we need to develop effective and accessible communication channels for research such as mine and future studies to ensure that all owners and horses can actually benefit from them. And finally, to make an attempt at applying this research to industry, I have created an infographic summarizing the key takeaways for horse owners in an easy to understand manner. So feel free to scan the QR code. And for those who cannot or would prefer not to, I'll show it on my screen in a few seconds. Thank you.